There's an organization here called HomeRise. They're one of the largest, I think the second largest provider of housing for the homeless in San Francisco. They have contracts that total about close to $100 million with the city over the course of like a 5-year span to provide housing for the homeless. They were subject to a third-party audit that was called for by the administration here because of some financial irregularities, and that audit became public yesterday. And in that audit, they found that there was what they called financial malfeasance and gross misreporting of funding, and also gross misuse of funding that was restricted specifically to house the homeless, that was being used to hold events that cost $12,000, limos, dinners, giving bonuses to people, creating new director positions within the organization, and then using the money that was supposed to be allocated to actually house people to pay people salaries instead. And over 118 credit cards. So, you might have a company credit card. If you're a big company, there might be 10 or 15 credit cards, but 118 credit cards, that accounts for almost half of the staff that work for HomeRise altogether, and a third of them had $10,000 credit limits or higher. And so there's no way to know unless we see those credit card statements if there was fraud committed, but it's highly suspected that there was. And so this calls for a further investigation. And of course, it's being downplayed. That's the thing that drives me crazy, is that the mayor released a statement today saying we won't tolerate theft or fraud with these organizations that contract with us. But I'm still waiting to see if like the district attorney or the city attorney is going to look into this. I hope it's on their radar, because there might be fraud. I'm not saying that there is, but there very well could have been, especially with those credit cards, because there was no way to track who had what and how much was being spent, what they were using it for. And we do know already that they used a bunch of money, hundreds of thousands of dollars, for things that were inappropriate, that they weren't supposed to be spending it on. Again, like parties and dinners and limousines and all of those things. So there's something very rotten at the core of HomeRise, and I understand they have new leadership now and they're trying to clean it up, but that doesn't excuse the malfeasance that occurred there for 3.5 years before people realized what was going on. And this just furthers that entire argument about the homeless industrial complex that you hear about all the time. And I don't even like to use that term, but this is representative of that. Well, first of all, it makes us, and should make everyone, really angry, because, San Francisco has an outsized problem with homelessness. And while all of these folks that pontificate about how we just need to house the homeless, when one of the largest organizations that's being given hundreds of millions of dollars to do so is committing fraud or financial malfeasance, then you have to start asking, well, is that really their intention to house the homeless, or is their intention to keep the gravy train running with money and promoting themselves and giving themselves bonuses and raises and all that just so they can get rich off of this? That's really what it is. And so if it's found that there was some serious malfeasance, which they already have, but if the city decides to act, I would like to see them pull all their contracts and redistribute them to other service providers and basically put them out of business. They shouldn't be there spending all of our money to house the homeless when 26% vacancy rates occur in their buildings, and they're having lavish parties with the money that's supposed to be used to help the poor, the needy, the ones that they say need the most help. It's egregious at best. It's fraud at worst. At the very least, if there's no fraud, there was definitely misappropriation of funds. And so whatever guardrails are in place to actually address that need to be handled and put in place quickly, okay, so that this doesn't ever happen again. And then that sends a message to other nonprofits that you need to clean up your books and start spending the money as it was intended. If there was fraud, which I believe there was, but that's just me personally, then I would hope that there would be criminal prosecution behind it, only because that's our money, our taxpayer dollars being used. The fact that that money was supposed to go to the most vulnerable of our populations, the homeless population, is extremely upsetting, and it's really, truly egregious that you would steal money from the poor to enrich yourselves. Who's watching them? Well, the Department of Homelessness and Supportive Housing in San Francisco, which is Housing First, they're supposed to be watching how these nonprofits spend their money. And they're supposed to be auditing them, etc. And clearly, they weren't watching. And so then you have to ask, well, who's watching the watchers? Who's watching the Department of Homelessness and Supportive Housing watch these nonprofits that are spending, $1.35 billion every 2 years on homeless services in San Francisco, and the homeless problem is actually getting worse. So it smacks of corruption. And I want to add one thing to this, if I could. This is the 11th nonprofit in San Francisco in the last couple of years that has fallen under investigation for either misappropriation of funds, corruption, or is being sued for wage theft. So if it's one nonprofit or two nonprofits, you might say, okay, I get it. They have to do some reorganization and tighten the ship. But when it's 11 nonprofits, 10 of which are there to serve the homeless, that's called a pattern of corruption. And I'm not afraid to say it. That is what it is. I believe that it's all kind of coming to the surface now. And it just speaks to the failure of our local government here to do its job, and the egregious financial mismanagement that's used, you could even argue, to enrich themselves by all these nonprofits that are out there supposedly helping the most needy. And it's really, really bad, and they need to be held accountable. I think it starts with accountability. We need to have that third-party company come in and audit every single nonprofit that has a contract with the city over $5 million. So anyone that has a contract over $5 million, which is about 100 plus nonprofits, needs to have a third-party independent audit done to make sure that they're spending the money correctly on what they're supposed to be spending it on, and not just enriching themselves and using it as a cash cow to pay themselves, because that's kind of what we've seen here with HomeRise. You start with that. And then you start looking around at other nonprofit organizations that do good work. And this is the problem, is that there's a lot of nonprofits out there that do really, really good work, like the Salvation Army is an example, that are above reproach, that aren't riddled with scandal. And start looking at those types of organizations to provide contracts to actually provide these services, where they actually really care about helping the homeless and not necessarily enriching themselves. That's what you have to do, and that requires political will. So that's going to require the mayor of San Francisco, whoever that's going to be this time next year, and the board of supervisors up here, to have the political will to call this out and say enough. A lot of it has to do with ideology. So in order to get a lot of contracts, you have to be housing first, or you have to be harm reduction model type of organization. The Salvation Army is a faith-based organization that promotes abstinence as part of their road to recovery. That's not to say that they don't embrace aspects of harm reduction and aspects of housing first. They just have more accountability built into their entire program. It's just an ideological difference, or a philosophical difference in belief around what do we need to do to actually help people get off the street, help them get off of drugs, get them mental health treatment if that's what they needed, and get their lives turned around. Because right now what you're seeing all these organizations take millions of dollars from the city, stick people in 80 square foot hotel rooms, and then wash their hands of it and say that we've housed these homeless people. And what's happening right now in San Francisco? Well, 37 people a month are dying of drug overdose inside permanent supportive housing. That's what's happening. And a whole bunch more aren't able to maintain their housing because they have all these untreated underlying issues like drug addiction and mental illness, where there's no requirement for them to go seek help for it. So they actually sit there with fentanyl behind a locked door in their room, and they use alone, and they die. And that's really it's not progressive, certainly not progressive. It's not compassionate, and I think it's cruel. Well, it's just that, I don't think this is just a San Francisco thing. I think that if you started looking into nonprofits in Los Angeles and San Diego and Portland and Seattle, I think you would find a lot of this malfeasance, they call it, around their spending and how they actually allocate their budgets and spend their money. It's very specific. When you take a contract from a city or state or federal government agency, they have a lot of strings attached, and it's very specific on how you can spend that money. And clearly these organizations, especially HomeRise, has not been following those guidelines at all. And that's the price of doing business with the government when it comes to housing the homeless. You have to follow these guidelines, and they're not doing it. And I think that if you started looking up and down the West Coast at all these cities that are struggling with homelessness and all these organizations that are supposed to be providing services to them, I bet you would find a lot of fraud and malfeasance and mismanagement and misappropriation of funds.
If you haven't checked out CaliforniaInsider.com, we highly recommend you do that now because we're going to have a lot of news and videos there. And on top of what we have there right now, we're building a really big platform to cover what's happening in California so you can be informed. We're going to have more shows, more videos from all aspects of life in California. Go to CaliforniaInsider.com and we'll see you there.